Chapter 38. At Warden Matthews' request, the Office of Inspection sent two investigators, Phil Potter and Jim Scheckenberg, from Washington, D.C. to the hot house in late 1988 to determine whether Cuban prisoners had been brutalized by Lieutenant Philip Schultz Jr. and his men. When they arrived, both investigators appeared to be sympathetic. We realized it was going to be frustrating to the officers to have us come in and second-guess them, said Scheckenberg. So we tried to be sensitive. Potter, a former lieutenant who had dealt with Cubans in Atlanta in 1984, told guards that he understood how difficult these prisoners could be. You admit you made a mistake and people will understand. It's the people who try to hide errors who get into trouble. Despite these assurances, the guards who had worked with Schultz considered both inspectors to be headhunters and didn't trust them. While Potter and Scheckenberg conducted their probe, these guards launched an investigation of their own. Word had leaked out that someone had given Warden Matthews a written account of brutality in the Cuban units, as well as the names of guards who were allegedly involved. This was true, of course. The prison counselor who had first raised the charges had written such a statement, but that counselor no longer worked for the Bureau. He had transferred to the Immigration and Naturalization Service, another branch of the Justice Department, and had left the prison several weeks before the inspectors arrived. Because the counselor was gone, none of the guards suspected him as the informant. Instead, they looked for someone within their own ranks who they figured had, in their words, snitched. It didn't take long for them to find a suspect. Officer Juan Torres, a quiet man in his early 30s, had worked at Leavenworth for only 6 months and had barely known Schultz, but Torres had never been accepted by the other guards. He was a loner who didn't stop at Benny's after work for a beer with the other guards. He spoke Spanish and had been seen joking and chatting with Cuban prisoners. He wasn't from the Leavenworth area. He had been recruited in Arizona, where the Bureau had gone to hire Hispanics. Most important of all, Torres was viewed as a do-gooder because he was a devout Roman Catholic and a guard who went by the rule book. We all figured he was the weak link, said a guard, but we weren't certain until he was interviewed by the headhunters. Without realizing it, Scheckenberg and Potter had inadvertently aided the guards in their search for the snitch. Scheckenberg had conducted his interviews in an upstairs office of the administration building, while Potter had done his in an office next to the warden's. It was impossible for a guard to enter either room without first being seen by the men working in the prison control center, and each time Potter or Scheckenberg called someone in for questioning, the guards in the center wrote down that man's name and timed the interview. Torres held the record, 90 minutes with Potter. Each night after work, the guards who had worked for Schultz gathered at Benny's to review the names on the control center list. Nearly all, they decided, could be trusted to follow the so-called Blue Code, an unwritten pact between law enforcement officers that requires them to never say anything incriminating against a fellow officer. Everyone, that is, except for Torres. As soon as Potter and Scheckenberg completed their investigation and left Leavenworth, the guards decided to test their theory. But rather than ask Torres point blank about what he had told Potter, they decided to take a subtle approach. I was eating lunch with some guys, Torres recalled later, when one of them asked if I would tell on someone if we saw him thump a Cuban. Everyone else said they wouldn't, but I didn't say nothing. This guy pressed me and I said, hey, I ain't losing my job or going to prison because of someone else. After that, people began calling me a snitch. Torres soon found himself being shunned by his peers. No one wanted to work on the same tier as he did. Most avoided speaking to him. One morning, when he went to his mailbox outside the lieutenant's office, he found the word snitch written all over his name. He tore the name tag off and replaced it with Torres, but an hour later, the word snitch was back. That night, he got the first of several obscene phone calls. Guys would call and say, hey snitch, how'd you like to suck my dick? And then hang up. One of the guards who claimed Torres was a snitch was unapologetic when asked later at Benny's why he was harassing him. We want that son of a bitch gone, and he'll eventually get the message. That guy's a rat. He tried to get us fired and put in prison. Lieutenant Slack saw what was happening and knew that Torres was being falsely accused. I began putting word out that the rumor about him wasn't true, said Slack. I put it out to people who I knew would pass it on down, but it was really up to Torres to prove that he wasn't a snitch, and that was going to take time. You see, there wasn't much I could do. If he didn't give any indication that he was a snitch, the other guards would accept him. But if he came running to me or Connor for help, then he would be marked forever as a snitch. The guards were not only angry at Torres, but at Matthews for notifying the Office of Inspections to begin with, rather than handling the charges himself, especially after Matthews made it clear that he didn't believe any brutality had taken place. Why in the hell did he put us through all this if he didn't believe anything happened, complained one. An incident shortly after the two investigators left town further alienated the guards. Associate Warden Lee Connor decided to discipline a popular veteran guard who was in charge of the metal detector in the East Prison Yard between the main penitentiary and prison industries. Each inmate was required to walk through the metal detector when he went to work each day, again at noon when he came back inside the main penitentiary for lunch, and later that afternoon when the workday ended. The detector was supposed to help the guard find knives, but it was so sensitive that it beeped whenever an inmate with a metal belt buckle or steel-tipped boots walked through it. Frisking each inmate didn't seem practical to the guard, so he simply waved most through, even if the machine beeped. Connor thought the guard was being lazy, but rather than lecturing him, he sent Lieutenant Tracy Johns to watch him for 2 days. Stationed at a window in the prison hospital, Johns faithfully recorded the number of inmates the guard actually frisked and then turned the data over to Connor. There weren't many, so Connor began the bureaucratic procedure to fire the guard. The guard protested and claimed that he knew based on his experience who needed to be frisked and who didn't. He notified his union representative, who immediately complained to Warden Matthews. According to the union contract, an employee was supposed to be told immediately if he had done something wrong. He was supposed to be given a chance to correct his behavior. He wasn't supposed to be spied on for 2 days and then fired. Matthews agreed, and Connor was forced to keep the guard on, although he was moved to a different job. Although Matthews had ruled in the favor of the guard, the incident was damaging. All he and Connor cared about is getting a promotion. And if they can do it by catching one of us screwing up, they'll do it, a guard complained. Connor further hurt his credibility by assigning an inexperienced guard to the metal detector. This officer decided to search every inmate, causing the line of inmates trying to get to work to back up like rush hour traffic. When the line at the detector was stalled for 15 minutes one morning, nearly 100 frustrated inmates protested by returning to their cells instead of going to work. Connor quickly switched guards at the detector, this time putting a veteran in charge. Like the original officer, the new man picked inmates at random to frisk. The confusion at the metal detector and the Cuban investigation had caused morale to sink to such a degree that one of the lieutenants decided on his own to find out what was wrong. "Why is morale so low?" he asked in the questionnaire slipped in each guard's mailbox. Connor was furious when he heard about the questionnaire and immediately demanded that it be collected and destroyed. "Of course, they'll say morale's low when you phrase a question that way," he explained. "There is a feeling that Matthews and Connor don't really know what they are doing," a veteran guard said later. "And that means one of these days we'll either have an escape or a riot and someone's going to get hurt." As was his nature, Matthews remained upbeat and positive as 1988 came to a close, but it was clear that he and Connor both needed a success. Eddie George gave them one. The unit manager in A cell house, George was supposed to spend his time conducting unit team sessions and filing paperwork, but he was still an investigator at heart, and when an inmate was found badly beaten in a recreation room in A cell house in early November, George decided to find out why. He had known for months that a group of strong-armed white convicts operated a poker game in the room, and he suspected that they were involved in drug dealing and extortion as well. He began monitoring their telephone conversations, and after listening to hours and hours of tape-recorded phone calls, he was able to identify the 3 inmates involved in the drug, gambling, and extortion ring. Each had foolishly bragged about making money while in prison. 2 of the inmates were the muscle behind the game. The third was the brains. George decided to check each of the prison accounts. Inmates were only allowed to have $20 in cash. Any more than that had to be deposited in an account at the prison, from which the inmates could draw to buy goods at the commissary. Besides keeping track of how much money each inmate had, the counting office kept a log that identified the names of family members or friends who sent money to the prison to be deposited in an inmate's account. George noticed that the inmate with the brains had only one contact who regularly sent him money. It was a woman in New Jersey. George jotted down her name and address and checked the records to the other two inmates in the ring. The same woman was making regular deposits in their accounts too. George asked the FBI to examine the woman's bank records. Based on his experience, George figured that the woman was working as a bank for the prisoners. Whenever an inmate got into debt by playing poker or buying dope or being the victim of extortion, he contacted relatives or friends outside the prison and asked them to send a check or money order to the woman in New Jersey. It wasn't uncommon for inmates to maintain bank accounts outside Leavenworth, particularly drug dealers and mafia figures. Sometimes the accounts were in the inmates' names, but often they were under the names of their relatives or girlfriends. Either way, money that was withdrawn from these accounts could not be tracked by the Bureau. After the woman in New Jersey received an inmate's check, she deposited in her account and then sent the 3 inmates in Leavenworth money orders that were automatically deposited into their prison accounts. A few weeks after George notified the FBI, an agent telephoned him and told him that the woman in New Jersey was depositing as much as $10,000 per month into her checking account, even though she was unemployed and didn't have any visible source of income. George wasn't surprised by what the FBI had discovered, but he was shocked at the amount that the ring in A Cell House was collecting. The woman was taking in as much as $120,000 a year, all of it apparently from illegal activities inside the hidehouse. Obviously, since the Bureau limited the amount an inmate could receive in prison to $105 per month, the woman was only depositing a small portion of what the ring was getting into Leavenworth's inmates' accounts. George figured the woman put the rest of the money into their bank accounts that the inmates controlled. The funds were probably used to buy drugs, which were then smuggled into prison by other outsiders. Even though George now understood what was happening, he didn't have enough evidence to make a case. He couldn't do anything but watch and wait. Then one afternoon, an inmate asked to see George in private. He explained that he wanted to transfer to a less secure prison closer to his home. George knew the inmate was a gambler, and he suspected that he played in a high-stakes game on the 4th tier. "I don't give nothing. What do you want?" the inmate asked. "The poker game on 4 Gallery." It was a formidable request because the white convicts running the game would probably kill anyone who turned them in. But the inmate agreed after George assured him that he would be transferred from the hidehouse before any arrests were made. The inmate not only gave George all the information that he needed, but also disclosed that the poker game was rigged. As soon as the informant was transferred, George turned the case over to Lieutenant Thh Ch, who promptly took the 3 inmates to the hole. The fact that they were arrested by Germany, not George, made it even more difficult for the inmates to figure out how they had been caught. All of them were sent to Marion. It was the biggest bust since Matthews became warden, and he and Connor were thrilled. Even Santa Claus couldn't have brought them a better present.